Chapter 4, Hemispheric Specialization. In 1961, a war veteran, W.J., had been suffering 2 grand mal seizures a week for the 10 years prior. His behavior and actions were normal besides the seizure and recovery activity. He was willing to try anything that would alleviate the seizure activity. His doctor performed the collosotomy procedure, severing the corpus callosum white fiber tracts, which connect the 2 cerebral hemispheres. The procedure was a great success. His seizures went away and his personality remained unchanged, which was very puzzling. This drove scientists, including Gazzaniga, to study this phenomenon, which gave rise to split brain research. Gazzaniga used a method based on the anatomy of the optic nerve and the visual pathways. The nerve from each eye divides in half and crosses over to the other side of the brain. Therefore, the parts of both eyes that view the right visual field are processed in the left hemisphere, and vice versa. It appeared that W.J. was blind to stimuli presented in his left visual field only. However, he was able to detect a light stimulus and report with Morse code, but not with words. The results were astounding. The 2 hemispheres were strikingly different in performance on the block design task, shown in the figure here. After surgery, W.J. could not arrange 4 red and white blocks in a simple pattern with his right hand. The surgery had disconnected specialized systems in the right hemisphere with motor components in the left hemisphere, giving rise to further work that showed that the left and right minds or sides of the brain functioned independently of each other. The press took hold of these findings, and the idea that the left brain thinks analytically and the right brain thinks creatively became a commonly held gross exaggeration of hemispheric specialization. Though there are fundamental differences between the hemispheres, there are also many similarities, making it impossible for the concept to be true of artists use their right brain, scientists use their left brain only. However, we did learn from split brain studies that the 2 hemispheres do not represent information in an identical manner. In the late 1950s, the dominant role of the left hemisphere in language was confirmed with the WADA test, a test still used in the treatment of seizure disorder. An amobarbital injection into the carotid artery produces rapid, brief anesthesia of the ipsilateral hemisphere, which is the same side as the injection. The patient is then put through a series of tests on language and memory. The test confirms the large role for the left hemisphere in language, because when injected into the left carotid artery, the patient's ability to speak or comprehend speech is disrupted. These results have been confirmed with imaging tests through both fMRI and PET methodologies. Language is preferentially biased to the left hemisphere in 96% of humans, and the right hemisphere is engaged in tasks that require higher level comprehension in language. There are some anatomical differences between the left and the right hemispheres, noted with a gross anatomy view as well. For instance, the 2 hemispheres are offset. The right hemisphere protrudes in the front and the left protrudes in the back. The right side is chubbier than the left in the frontal region. The left side is larger in occipital region than the right. The Sylvian fissure or lateral fissure, the large sulcus that defines the superior border of the temporal lobe, has a more prominent curl upward in the right than the left. In addition, the planum temporale, the cortical area at the center of Wernicke's area, is larger in 65% of left hemispheres. Interestingly, in children with dyslexia, this region is symmetrical, a clue that the language difficulties may stem from a lack of a specialized left hemisphere. MRI studies show that, interestingly, in adults with dyslexia, the typical medial temporal lobe asymmetries were reversed. Cell size differences demonstrated in this figure suggest a greater long-range connectivity in the language-associated areas of the left hemisphere, as the neurons in the left hemisphere appear to be larger than the right. However, differences in columnar spacing and dendritic tree size would cause cells in the left hemisphere to connect to fewer neurons. This structural specialization might underlie more elaborate and less redundant patterns of connectivity, which in turn might give rise to better separation between local processing streams. As we've discussed, the corpus callosum, the largest white matter tract, connects the left and right hemispheres. It is made up of approximately 250 million axonal fibers that cross from one side of the brain to the other, facilitating interhemispheric communication. Seen in purple, the corpus callosum is the primary communication highway between the two cerebral hemispheres. The anterior portion is the genu, the middle portion is the body, and the posterior portion is the splenium. Fiber sizes vary as the smaller fibers are located anteriorly and the larger fibers are located posteriorly. Using diffusion tensor imaging, the corpus callosum can be partitioned into vertical segments carrying regionally similar and different information, as depicted in this figure here. Most connections link regionally similar areas and are known to be homotopic. An example, the left prefrontal cortex connects with the right prefrontal cortex. However, some fibers are heterotopic and carry information connecting regionally different areas. An example, the prefrontal cortex to premotor areas in both hemispheres. A much smaller band of fibers connecting the two hemispheres is the anterior commissure. It is about 1/10 the size of the corpus callosum and connects regions of the temporal lobes, in particular the amygdala. Even smaller is the posterior commissure, seen on the left, which also carries some interhemispheric fibers, and particularly fibers that contribute to the papillary light reflex. Several functional roles have been proposed for callosal connections. For example, in the visual association cortex, receptive fields can span both visual fields. Communication across the callosum enables information from both visual fields to contribute to the activity of these cells. The corpus callosum connections play a major role in synchronizing oscillatory activity in cortical neurons as an object passes through these receptive fields. Other researchers view corpus callosum activity as primarily inhibitory, providing a means for each hemisphere to compete for control of our current processing. Hemispheric specialization must have been influenced by corpus callosum evolution. Expansion of the cortex may have required greater connections across the corpus callosum. Isolation of newly added cortices would have resulted in divergence among the functional capabilities of homotopic regions, resulting in cerebral specializations. This figure depicts the synchronizing role of the corpus callosum, as when the corpus callosum is severed, synchrony of neuronal activity is not demonstrated. When receptive fields, seen in 1 and 2, on either side of fixation are stimulated by two separate light bars moving in different directions as indicated by the arrows, the firing rates of the two cells are not correlated. In animals with an intact corpus callosum, cells with spatially separate receptive fields fire synchronously when they are stimulated by a common object, such as a long light bar spanning both fields. In animals whose corpus callosum has been severed, synchrony is rarely observed. Through development, there are greater fibers in the corpus callosum. They then, over time, get pruned as connections, but not neurons, are lost. In addition, there are sex differences in the corpus callosum, where a larger chunk of the corpus callosum bulges on the right side in males, suggestive of less on the left. This may account for accelerated language development in females, and more often, males have better visuospatial tasks and increased left-handedness. Fetal testosterone plays a role in this sex difference in the posterior section of the corpus callosum. Corpus callosotomy or split brain surgery is used to treat intractable epilepsy when other forms of treatment, such as medication, have failed. Epileptic seizures are the result of abnormal electrical discharges that zip across the brain. The first procedure was performed in 1940, and the surgery was a great success. The patient appeared and felt completely normal, and the seizures subsided immediately. In others, 80% of patients showed a 60 to 70% decrease in seizure activity, and some were free of seizures altogether. The results of testing done on patient WJ were contrary to earlier reports on the effects of split brain procedures as reported in 1940, where they found no neurological and psychological effects after the callosotomy was severed. Careful testing with WJ and other patients showed that the visual system had demonstrated changes post-surgery. Visual information presented to one half of the brain was not available to the other half, consistent with the fact that the visual system is discretely lateralized and we rely on it heavily. In this figure, the idea is demonstrated where the split brain patient reports through the speaking hemisphere only the items flashed to the right half of the screen and denies seeing left field stimuli or recognizing objects presented to the left hand. Nevertheless, the left hand correctly retrieves objects presented in the left visual field. The split brain patients cannot name or describe visual and tactile stimuli presented to the right hemisphere because the sensory information is disconnected from the dominant left speech hemisphere. Nonverbal response techniques are required to demonstrate the competence of the right hemisphere. For example, the left hand can be used to point to named objects or to demonstrate the function of depicted objects presented in the left visual field. Again, the visual information presented to one side was not available to the other, and the same principle applied to touch. The patients named objects and described them if in the right hand, but nothing within when in the left hand. From a cognitive point of view, these initial studies confirmed long-standing neurological knowledge about the nature of the two cerebral hemispheres. The left hemisphere is dominant for language, speech, and major problem solving, and its verbal IQ and problem-solving capacity remain intact. The right hemisphere is impoverished in cognitive tasks and appears specialized for visuospatial tasks like drawing cubes and 3D patterns. It requires nonverbal techniques to find out what the right brain is thinking. Surgical cases of partial collosotomy allows for specific callosum function by region. Tactile information is transferred by fibers in a region anterior to the splenium. It is found that the posterior half of the corpus callosum transmits visual, tactile, and auditory sensory information, while the anterior half transfers higher order information. More specifically, the anterior part transfers semantic information about the stimulus, but not information about the stimulus itself. As we have seen so far, some of the brain's processes are lateralized, especially as evidenced by WJ and other patients with the language and speech and visuospatial processing. In addition, there is evidence for hemispheric specialization with regards to information processing, attention and perception, and in all, how we interpret the world around us. With language, the separated left hemisphere normally comprehends all aspects of language, as is the case with 96% of people. However, linguistic capabilities of the right hemisphere do exist, although they are uncommon. In fact, the non-linguistic emotional component of speech is known as emotional prosody, is right side lateralized. This was shown in a patient with left hemisphere damage who showed difficulty comprehending words, but little challenge in interpreting the emotional meaning of words. If we consider the lexicon of the brain, the mind's dictionary, there appears to be two separate lexicons, one in each hemisphere. The right hemisphere's lexicon seems organized differently from the left hemisphere's lexicon, and these lexicons are accessed in different ways. These observations are consistent with the view that lexicons reflect learning processes and, as such, are more widely distributed in the cerebral cortex. Generative syntax, or that by following the rules of grammar, we can combine words in an unlimited number of meanings, is present in only one hemisphere. The right hemisphere is capable of understanding language but not syntax and cannot make inferences either. The capacity of the right hemisphere to make inferences is extremely limited. Two words are presented in serial order, and the right hemisphere, left hand, is simply required to point to a picture that best depicts what happens when the words are causally related. The left hemisphere finds these tasks trivial, but the right cannot perform the task. The two hemispheres have different visuospatial processing. The right hemisphere is superior to the left in neuropsychological testing, like with the block design task. The right hemisphere is also better at discriminating upright and similar faces. The left hemisphere does not perform well at discriminating similar faces, but is good with dissimilar ones when one feature is different. For example, blonde versus brunette hair. The left hemisphere is biased at recognizing one's own face, whereas the right hemisphere detects familiar faces of others better. Voluntary expressions that can signal intention have their own cortical networks in humans. The neural networks for spontaneous expressions involve older brain circuits and appear to be the same as those found in chimpanzees. The location of the section has been overlaid onto each face as seen here. Theory of mind refers to our ability to take another's perspective and understand that other individuals have thoughts, beliefs, and desires. Much of the prevailing research on theory of mind suggests that if it is lateralized at all, it is lateralized to the right hemisphere. Brain regions involved include the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior superior temporal sulcus, precuneus, and the amygdala temporopolar cortex. The hallmark of human intelligence is our ability to make causal interpretations about the world around us, to formulate hypotheses and predictions about the events and actions in our lives, and to create a continuous, sensible narrative about our place in the world. The ability to make interpretations based on our experiences is a critical component of our intellect. The causal inferences and interpretations appear to be a specialized ability of the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere interprets actions initiated by the right, but sometimes it interprets the moods caused by the experiences of the right hemisphere. The evolutionary pressures that underlie hemispheric specialization include the need for unified action, rapid communication, and reduced costs associated with interhemispheric processing. These would also be advantageous for other species. It is now clear that hemispheric specialization is not unique to humans. For example, in birds, almost all of the optic fibers cross at the optic chiasm, ensuring that all visual input from each eye projects solely to the contralateral hemisphere. Another example comes from the categorization of stimuli in chickens. Chickens are more proficient in discriminating food from non-food items when stimuli are presented to the right eye, whereas the right hemisphere, left eye, is more adept when they are trained to respond to unique properties like color, size, and shape, or when the task requires them to learn the exact location of a food source. Other examples come from non-human primates. Great apes use their right hand and arm when making communication gestures. Also, split-brain rhesus monkeys have the right hemisphere advantage in facial recognition tasks, as humans do. In general, many tasks can be performed successfully by either hemisphere, although the two hemispheres may differ in efficiency. The two hemispheres may also work in concert to perform a task, even though their contributions may vary. What about the role of the brain in consciousness? Split-brain research offers a window into the conscious experience, as it has been shown that the right hemisphere specifically contributes to conscious experience when the corpus callosum is intact only. However, our entire conscious experience arises out of the concerted activity of specialized modules or systems in the brain, while the left hemisphere's interpreter strings them together in a coherent narrative.